Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. In a recent article in Foreign Affairs, co-authored with Josh Feldman, entitled Why India Can't Replace China, India's former chief economic advisor has punctured the belief that the decline of China will automatically lead to the rise of India. Joining me now to explain why he's come to this conclusion is Arvind Subramanian. Dr. Subramanian, in a recent article for Foreign Affairs, entitled Why India Can't Replace China, which you co-authored with Josh Feldman, you refute the belief that India is about to replace China as the workshop of the world. You write, and I quote, "Will New Delhi be able to seize this opportunity? The answer is not obvious. There is no inevitability, no straight line in causation from the decline of China to the rise of India." And then you critically add, only if the Indian authorities are willing to change course and remove the obstacles to investment and growth will the rosy pronouncements of pundits come true. If not, India will continue to muddle along. Now, before we discuss your reasons for coming to this conclusion, can you confirm this is in fact your conclusion?
Yeah, the way I would put the conclusion, Karan, is simple. That a big opportunity has arisen for India from the decline of China. But opportunity is not destiny. A lot of things need to happen in between to convert that opportunity to destiny. And what that requires is a change in actions, the policy environment, policy stance of the government. And if it can do that, then indeed opportunity can be converted into something quite promising for India. But that's why there's...
Sorry, carry on.
So one, there's no... Just to kind of develop on this a little bit, what has happened in the last few years, that India has started looking good in relative terms, relative not just within the region, because Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh are all facing serious crises, have faced. China is in, real precipitous kind of downward spiral. Maybe it might come out a little bit, but its situation there is pretty serious. So if you look around the world among emerging markets, the country that looks, reasonably stable, reasonably prosperous is India. So that has changed quite a bit. And more specifically, capital, which was, flooding to China over 30, 40 years, is reassessing its thing. And one of the natural places they look for is India. But that's the opportunity. But the warning and the caution is that there's no necessity that capital will come to India necessarily, unless there's a change in policy stance. So there's new opportunity, but no guarantee that that's better destiny.
All right, let's then come to the reasons why you believe, and I'll use your phraseology, This opportunity may not necessarily translate into destiny. Or to put it in the simple language I used earlier, the reasons why you believe the decline of China won't automatically lead to the rise of India. First, you say, and I'm quoting you again, popular assumptions about a booming economy are inaccurate. You say India's rise faltered after the 2008 global financial crisis and stalled completely after 2018. More pertinently, you point out, India's annual growth rate over the past 3 years has been just 2.5%, which is, of course, way short of India's potential of 7%. And you say this means the economy is still struggling to regain its pre-pandemic footing. Doesn't this mean that our growth is not on a rising trajectory? It's either a declining trajectory or it's plateaued.
Yeah. So, Karan, it's important to clarify this. See, because part of the boosterism about India has been the growth rate this year and last year, which has been high. This year, 6.5, whatever people are saying. Last year was also quite high. And that's why, and that is a little bit misleading, because the year before, the pandemic year, the Indian economy really tanked. And in 2019-20 as well, the Indian economy did not do very well. So if one were to take a slightly longer view and said, where does India stand today relative to some pre-pandemic normal? Because, the pandemic has, upended things and even how we measure things. So if we compare it to a pre-pandemic normal, growth is actually quite feeble, about 2.7 a year since 2019, and about the same since you compare it with 2018-19. So over a longer period, 3 to 4 years, Indian growth has been fairly feeble, and the recovery seems great because it's coming off a very low base. And that's why we should check our caution in saying, wow, the Indian economy is really booming. And that's the corrective that I want to introduce.
Now, the second thing you point out, and again, I'm quoting you, the forward-looking indicators are hardly more encouraging. Announcements of new projects have fallen off after a brief post-pandemic rebound, and there is not much evidence that foreign firms are relocating production to India. In fact, overall, foreign direct investment has stagnated for the past decade, remaining around 2% of GDP. So this means you see the investments by Apple and Foxconn, which people talk a lot about, as actually one-offs, not the start of a growing trend.
Right. I think it's one of the key indicators for assessing whether, the economy is poised for sustained medium-term growth is to look at things like private investment and exports. I mean, these are fundamentally the long-term basis of growth. Private investment has been very weak for a very long time. And as you said, foreign direct investment has basically stagnated over. So there's no evidence of a real boom, either in private investment or in foreign, i.e., neither domestic nor foreign investment are really, giving cause for really optimism or anything like that. Exports, which did well, for about 2 years or 18 months after the pandemic, exports did very well, but that too has leveled off. So looking ahead, you don't see the fundamental drivers of growth looking up really positively, which then leads to the question that you asked, what about Apple? Apple is a little bit different from Foxconn. Foxconn, I think, is still in the works. Apple, they've actually relocated. How should we think about Apple and the fact that it's moved? I think, first of all, I think there's no question that the fact that Apple chose to relocate to India is definitely a good sign and good news for India. The question is, what do you make of it? Is it a one-off, or is it or something else happening? Now, I would at this stage be more cautious about viewing this as the beginning of a surge for 2 or 3 reasons. One, as we mentioned in the article, for every Apple that has come, there have been lots of other foreign companies that have been either hurt or have actually left India. So one has to be careful and not be selective about cherry picking the evidence. One. Second, there is something special about Apple, because Apple is really coming for a big cell phone market in India, and they see that as promising. Why one should keep our minds open and not jump to any conclusions as yet is, if this leads to a sustained increase in exports, and if other companies also kind of come in line and join in and come to India, then one would be more hopeful. At this stage, it's a one-off. Other companies have not had such a good experience. There's particularities about the Apple move. So we have to wait and watch to see whether this is something durable or not. But there's no doubt that Apple coming to India, partly it's push because China is looking much bleaker. Partly they've realized that amongst the alternatives, India is a plausible one. But remember, even on that, Apple has said they are going to check it out. They're going to relocate a fraction of their production. Then they will see, are things working out, and then decide to commit more resources to India.
Let me, in fact, elaborate one point for the audience. You talked about other companies that have had unsuccessful experiences in India. In fact, in your article, you mentioned 4 or 5. You say for every firm that has embraced India, many more have had unsuccessful experiences in India, including Google, Walmart, Vodafone, and General Motors. And even Amazon has announced as recently as November that they are shutting down Indian ventures. This is something that when people talk about Apple, they either forget or deliberately overlook. And as you point out, for every firm that's embraced India, there are many more that have actually had an unsuccessful experience. So overall, people are wary. That's the point that people forget.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think we have to look at the totality of the experience of foreign capital and then wait and see how it, pans out going forward. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Let's then at this point, Dr. Subramanian, come to the reasons why foreign firms are wary of India. In your article with Josh Feldman, you devote a fair amount of time to explaining these reasons, and they are things that, in fact, an Indian audience should be particularly aware of and concerned about. First, you point out, firms still lack the confidence that the policies in place when they invest will not be changed later in ways that render their investments unprofitable. In other words, foreign firms don't believe that there will be consistency and continuity of policy. They don't trust the government not to keep changing its mind. That is a deep concern for them, because once they've invested, and if the policy changes, then the basis of their investment gets undermined, and they're extremely unhappy because they stand to lose money.
Yeah. See, I think that a key point here is policy consistency and continuity are important to reassure investors. If you keep changing the rules of the game, it just creates a lot of uncertainty. But I think the second complicating factor, which I think you might come to later, but I think it's related, is that this inconsistency, if it's driven by a playing field that's not level, even amongst domestic investors and between domestic and foreign investors, that adds to the problem. The case of e-retail, for example, where foreign firms came in and the regulatory regime was kind of changed to favor domestic firms, national champions in India. So that experience, that the policy framework and regime can be changed to favor some over others, I think that is actually can be very damaging. It's not just, remember, it's not just foreign investors, but also domestic private investors who are wary of, say, we get into a field or a sector, and then the rules are changed, to favor some firms over others, and that kind of is very chilling for investment.
Let me quote that particular bit of your article. You say firms cannot be sure that rules will be enforced impartially rather than in favor of national champions. And I'll decode that phrase, national champions, for the audience. What you're really suggesting is that the government will favor Adani and Ambani at the cost of either foreign investors or even private Indian domestic investors. And that puts people off because once again they feel, to use a colloquialism, they are being cheated.
Yeah, I think, look, I think there is a broad sense that some groups, and you've named them, have received a lot of regulatory favors over the last several years. And I think that, in some cases, it may be, I don't know, it may lead to good outcomes. I don't know, maybe it will. But on balance, if you want to look at overall investment, then we have to consider what the impact of this is on others who may want to get into similar fields or other fields. So that, I think, to have an open system that favors competition rather than some incumbents is something that we have to be careful about. On a lighter vein, Karan, that famous quote from Latin America, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law. I think that, we have to be careful that, we don't use the rule, the law itself to favor some, and we keep changing the regulations to favor some over others. I think that can have a...
I'll just point out that this is actually becoming a fairly serious international concern because literally just last week, the Washington Post had a very long, detailed article about how rules, laws, regulations, and a whole lot of other government decisions have been deliberately tweaked to help and support Adani companies, which in fact have put people off and worried people. And this therefore means that what you're referring to here is something that the Western media and the Western press is writing about and Western investors are therefore aware of. But let me come to another reason why, in fact, foreign investors might be put off by the way the government is seeking to attract them. And oddly enough, this time, it's a problem that arises out of the production-led investment scheme, which, to be honest, was designed by the government to attract investors. And yet there's an element of it that is a serious cause of concern. And this is because tariffs on foreign-made components are raised. And this means, and again, I'm quoting you, since advanced products in many sectors are typically made of hundreds or even thousands of parts sourced from the most competitive producers worldwide, if you attach high tariffs to these parts, New Delhi ends up providing a powerful disincentive for firms contemplating investment in the country. And now what we're actually pointing out is a paradox. A scheme designed to attract investment from abroad actually has serious elements that end up putting them off.
Exactly. I think that the whole production-linked incentive scheme is in principle, I think, you could say that all countries are pursuing industrial policy. And so this is part of the policy-making tool in modern times that countries use to attract investment. We'll come to, there are elements in that which one also has to worry about in terms of arbitrariness, the kind of, whether it chooses the right sectors. For example, labor-intensive sectors have not benefited from these incentives. So there are a whole bunch of issues. Will there be a sunset clause to end them? So there are all these issues related to these production-linked incentive schemes, i.e. they're prone to capture and all these things. But the point you're raising is distinct and a different one, which is exactly that on the one hand, we give subsidies to attract investment, but on the other hand, we in fact raise their cost of production by raising tariffs on the components that they will use. Because if you raise the tariffs, then the cost of inputs will become more expensive and it will undermine the incentive that you gave in the first place. So that's the reason why there's something a bit, kind of inconsistent about this. On the one hand, we say we want our firms to be internationally competitive. That's kind of the big motivation for this. But on the other hand, we make doing business and buying components much more expensive. So that's the kind of contradiction or a tension between this, quite apart from possible problems in implementing a scheme such as this, which involves picking winners, selecting sectors, making decisions. Bureaucrats have to make decisions, and all the complications that can come from them. Karan, can I go back to the point about national champions? Because I think one has to be a little bit fair and clear about this. Creating national champions is problematic, right? For all kinds of political and economic reasons. But I think one has to be, because the rejoinder comes back, well, other countries promote national champions as well. What's the problem? Korea did it some time ago. France and Europe do it all the time. What's the problem? I think the problem in India with promoting national champions is twofold. One is the scope of these national champions in terms of their reach in the economy, the sectors that they're present in, is just, almost unprecedented in history. The two groups that you mentioned, the sectors that they are in, cement, retail, aerospace, defense, media, etc., they're just very, very big. And then you worry about the effects of that. That's one. But the second thing is that when countries, give these favors in terms of subsidies and so on, the successful ones have been able to impose discipline on them. And the discipline often comes from the fact that they're forced to export and show that they're competitive in global markets. The problem with many of the sectors in which are national champions, they're all in domestic, non-tradable sectors, which are not necessarily exposed to the winds of international competition. So a regulatory favor can very easily lead to a monopoly position or an inefficiency in a way that there would be less fear had these champions been operating in sectors where they had to face international competition. So it's very important to note what is distinctive about our national champion strategy as well.
Now, there is a fourth disincentive, and this may actually surprise a lot of people. Very quickly, I'll cap on the first three so that audience is aware what they are. The first disincentive is the lack of consistency and continuity in policy. The second is the favoring of national champions, which we've just discussed. The third is elements of the production-led incentive scheme, which in fact work against it attracting people. But the fourth is a particularly surprising disincentive. And again, I'm going to quote you. Only 15% of the population can be considered middle class according to international definitions, while the rich, who account for a large share of GDP, tend to save a large share of their earnings. And you say both factors reduce middle class consumption. For most firms, as a result, the risks of doing business in India outweigh the potential rewards. Now, this goes against the ingrained belief people have that our population of 1.4 billion is a natural attraction and enticement for foreign investors. You're pointing out actually that we have a very small middle class. And as you point out, the middle class market in India is only $500 billion compared with a global market of some 30 trillion. So it's a fraction in global terms and not such an inducement or attraction.
Right. You see, just to step back, the reason why the government was confident in its, Atmanirbharta inward-looking policy was they said, we have a big market, so we can afford to turn inward because firms will want to come for our domestic market. So even if they can't compete internationally, we have a big market, so they will come. Now, I think that's where I think we did some simple number crunching, Soumitra Chatterjee and I. And what we find is that, the middle class market is actually quite, reasonably, is not very big. Let's put it this way. And as you point out, Karan, I think in India, generally, I think we are seduced by our size. Size in itself does not translate into purchasing power. And what we found surprisingly was, if you look at the Indian economy is, let's say, $3 trillion GDP. But we have a lot of fairly poor people. So that takes away a chunk of the economy. Then you say, what's left? Well, what's left is a big chunk, but it's not, it's about somewhere between 5 and 15% of the population, if you apply this benchmark for what's kind of middle class. And then, but even that chunk that goes to the very rich, they tend to save a lot. So a combination of having a fair amount of poor people, a fairly limited middle class, and a few very rich people accounting for a lot of income who don't spend, who save, the combination of these three leads to a shrinking middle class market for consumption. And that market is much less than China's middle class market. And it's much less than the global market, which is why we've always said, Josh and I have always said, we should aim for the international market, not for the domestic market, because that's not very big. Investors are not going to be lured by that, especially, as you said, when they do that cost-benefit calculation. What are the risks? What are the rewards? The rewards of the pure domestic market are not that high, and we should not be seduced by our size. And that's why and that translates, therefore, into policies, therefore, should say, how do we attract investment that can be internationally competitive? Then you wouldn't be imposing these tariffs. You wouldn't necessarily be promoting national champions. So the policy mix changes from that diagnosis that our domestic market is not very big.
I'll just point out at this moment that if the policy is to be, as you're suggesting, make in India but make for the world, then the promotion of national champions becomes problematic for one more further reason. And also the production-led incentive scheme, which raises tariffs on imported components, also becomes very problematic. Those will have to change if you're serious about saying make in India, but make for the world. But there are two other disincentives that you mentioned in that article that I'd like to turn to very quickly. The first is that there is a certain amount of concerns about India's macroeconomic features. You point out that the current account deficit and inflation are, as you put it, off kilter, although since you wrote that article, the inflation rate has fairly sizably come down, is now below 6%. But the real concern about India's macroeconomics is, in fact, its collected fiscal deficit. For the center and the states combined, you say, it's around 10% of GDP, and that means it's one of the highest in the world, with interest payments alone accounting for more than 20% of the budget. Here, could you explain to a lay audience why this high fiscal deficit would put off investors?
Yeah. See, very simply, investors look for political stability, economic and financial stability. If your inflation is high, if your current account deficit is very high, if your fiscal deficit is very high, all these can lead to, anxieties about financial stability. It's not that India is going to have a crisis or anything of that sort, but still it makes investors nervous that, the policies, the situation can get a little bit out of control, and therefore they kind of don't have the confidence to remain in the country. There's a second, more important way in which this matters is what we call, if the government deficit is very high, that means the government is getting or taking away resources that otherwise the private sector would have to invest. That's the very concrete way in which having a very high deficit reduces the resources for private investment. We call this crowding out, and that's, I think, really very important. The last point, I think it's something that you mentioned, is something that, Indian audiences should understand. That, look, our deficits are high, 10% of GDP. It is pretty high, but, that itself, need not be cause for panic. But what it does is, and this has been true over the years, because of these consistently high deficits, the amount of tax resources that go towards paying just interest on what you've borrowed in the past, as opposed to using those for development expenditures. I mean, India is just off the charts on that. That means out of every 1 rupee that the government spends, 20 paise is going for just repaying past borrowing. So, and that's very, India's really off the charts on this. So a consequence of those deficits is also having less resources to spend in things that investors would care about.
Now, there's one more disincentive that you mentioned in that article in Foreign Affairs. And again, I'll quote you. A final barrier to growth, you say, is a deep structural shift that has undermined the dynamism and competitiveness of private enterprise. You're talking about India's informal sector, and I assume you mean MSMEs in particular, which account for roughly 30% of GDP and 45% of employment. Again, for a lay audience, could you explain why this would put off investors?
See, I think, look, when we think about private investment, Karan, right? You think of investment in the formal sector by big firms and investment by the informal sector firms. And they're part of an ecosystem, the big firms and the small firms. And there's a kind of two-way relationship. If big firms do badly, informal firms don't do well either. But there's also a reverse flow that actually the informal sector is part of the competitiveness of the formal sector. You get your, labor more cheaper, you get your inputs cheaper from the informal sector. So if the informal sector is damaged or scarred, remember, the thing about India is that the informal sector, the small and medium enterprise sector, have faced 3 successive shocks: demonetization, the goods and services tax, and then the pandemic. So the cumulative impact of this is, if they are enfeebled, then they cannot be a source of cheap inputs, efficiency, cheap labor for the formal sector, and therefore the competitiveness of the formal sector will also correspondingly decline, which will then make India less competitive globally as well. So that's the kind of connection between the formal and the informal sector.
Now, to sum up, you say India faces 3 major obstacles in its quest to become the next China. First, investment risks are too big. Second, policy inwardness is too strong. And third, macroeconomic imbalances are too high. And you're right, these obstacles need to be removed before global firms will invest, since they do have other alternatives. And that is something people forget. It's not that India is the only option available to them. There are many other countries they could go to, which might actually provide and offer them more enticing environments. People forget this in India, don't they?
Yeah. See, I think, again, this is where I think, the kind of destiny part, the automaticity from the decline of China to the rise of India. There are several, intermediate steps as well. One of those is, yes, China is declining, but is India the only alternative destination for this? Because remember, we've had episode 1 of this already. Episode 1 of capital kind of looking at alternatives to China happened after the global financial crisis, because at that stage, capital was looking for it not because of geopolitics, but because China was becoming rich and therefore uncompetitive in labor-intensive sectors. In episode 1, about $150 billion of that, China lost exports, but that did not come to India. That went predominantly to Vietnam, some to Bangladesh, some to Indonesia. Now, because at that stage, foreign firms just did not consider us, a competitive destination. Now, the second one has come around. This is a more serious shock because there's potentially going to be more exit from China for geopolitical reasons and other natural reasons. And therefore, we're getting excited that there's a kind of inevitability that will come to India. And that's what I think, that complacency we should shed, because there are alternatives. And what are the alternatives? They can go into Asia, other ASEAN countries, Vietnam, which seem very dynamic. Indonesia is a potential location. Second, there's all this talk about reshoring and friendly shoring by, Western policymakers. So they may try and attract some of this back to advanced economies. That's a possibility. And the third possibility that also, which I think is a new point that Josh and I point out, is that, China will then is responding. China is opening up, for example, in response to these things. Of course, they have a major health problem to deal with. But if China says, look, we have to reassess what we're doing, then, that too is a possibility that firms say, look, one possibility is we take the extra risk in China. So all this is to say that please let us not be complacent. It's in our hands. Let's create the right investment risk environment. Let's create an openness policy orientation. Let's address our macro imbalances. And then indeed, we can convert this opportunity into a resurgence of India more broadly and more durably.
Two very quick questions, and I'll ask you to give me brief answers because I'm terribly scared that the Zoom link may be ending. Do you see these obstacles being removed in the near and foreseeable future, or will the government fail to remove them and therefore fail to attract the investment departing China?
Well, I hope they will change, but I think I am more confident that the macro imbalances might be addressed because I feel that the government has really embraced inward orientation and national champions as, there's strong conviction about that. And so that I'm not confident that that will change so easily. On the macro imbalances, I think maybe there is scope for improvement, but on the other two, I'm not sure.
What about continuity of policy, and what about adjusting the production-led incentive scheme? Very quickly.
I'm not sure. I think let's see. I think we're going to look at the evidence. Government will look at the evidence, and then they will have to see how to recalibrate it, if at all. So let's wait and see.
Let me quote the last sentence of your Foreign Affairs article. Whether or not India turns into the next China is something that will require a dramatic policy shift by New Delhi itself. That means if we fail to attract that investment, the government is to blame.
Karan, you are braver and smarter than I am to predict whether there's going to be failure lying ahead. So I think before we get into things like blame, it's a bit premature to second guess what the future is going to be. Let's wait and see. But I think that the key thing is the lesson we should take away is, wow, there's new and big opportunity. This is our moment, but policy inwardness, a stable investment regime, a level playing field, what Josh and I have previously called the software of economic policy making, because the government has had achievements in hardware, etc.
It's the stuff. Build on that. The software needs to change. I'll end by putting it like this. We have an opportunity, but if the government doesn't change its policies, we will not attract the investment we're hoping we will attract from China. It all depends on what the government does.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well put, Karan.
Dr. Subramanian, thank you very much for this interview.
Thanks for having me, Karan. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.